and we don't want everybody to be hanging on. So Editors Guild of India welcomes you to a full-day conclave, Press Freedom at 75. Now, we have 4 sessions through the day, but before going into the program, a word about EGI. We are a voluntary group of senior editors from across the country, founded and established in 1978 by veteran journalists like Kuldeep Nair and others. Mr. Nair, as you all know, and if you're a journalist, you definitely know.
Can you hear me now?
Had been arrested during the emergency. And he came out of jail with a realization.
I can't hear Seema speaking. I can't hear Seema.
That it was important for senior journalists.
Audio?
This audio seems on, I don't know.
Okay, we're sorry about this, but we'll continue. Is it? Anyway, so as you know that he was arrested during the emergency, he came out and he realized, along with all the others, that it was important for senior journalists to come together, for all journalists to come together, to be united, and to form a body to preserve the ethics, rights, responsibilities of journalists. And that press freedom is not something that we can take for granted, even as far back as that. It was part of democracy. We are the 4th pillar of democracy, but it is not something that was a given. And we almost lost it in 1974-75. Since then, EGI has worked to give teeth to these values of honest, independent, courageous journalism. And new challenges have been met along the way and faced now, even in these difficult times. Journalists, as we all know, are individuals. That's the nature of our job. We have our own views. We differ on everything. But we are united when it comes to freedoms, when it comes to preserving our rights and keeping the space that is essential for a thriving democracy. EGI, to remain transparent and to move with the changing times, we decided that we would move away slightly from the system of nominations to elections. COVID, during which we have all lost colleagues and very valuable colleagues, also brought home new technological tools through which we built together a new edifice, if I want to put it like that, with our colleagues from different parts of the country. They all participated in not just the elections, but are participating in conferences like the one being held today. We have held several one-day meetings on the issues facing journalists in the Northeast, in Kashmir, in the so-called Naxal areas, where journalists from those belts have come in, participated, shared their woes and their problems. EGI has moved the Supreme Court on Pegasus against surveillance, on sedition against the misuse of draconian laws against journalists doing their job. And we have taken up the arrest and intimidation of fellow journalists by state and now non-state actors. Our speakers will dwell on this as we move through the day. Now, to open our conclave, a big, big thank you to Kumkum Chadda and our program committee, and not least to Vidhi, who have worked tirelessly to make this possible. Kumkum is the moving force. We just the fawning supporters impressed with her speed and efficiency. Our first session is on media and ethics, rights and responsibilities. All extremely important, the overarching theme under which we actually discuss everything. Important as journalism seems to be wilting from arrest under heinous laws of sedition, UAPA and the works, intimidation, harassment. Not so long ago, as you all remember, women journalists were targeted on the social media in a most vile and ugly and vulgar fashion. From surveillance, as in the case of Pegasus, that is before the honorable courts, from sackings, as big media houses do not hesitate to lay off hundreds in one time, from abusive newsrooms where juniors face the brunt of absolutely non-journalistic behavior from those so-called seniors, and from our own, where we indulge in fake news, where we forget journalism, we move into complete propaganda, we invade privacy, where we allow the tenets of journalism to be literally made so murky that we find that we are losing respect in the public domain, and we are forgetting that our task is to question and to critique and not be flag bearers of governments. For all this and more, we could not have had better speakers, as you will see through the day, persons who have proved themselves on the field without compromise, who have stood the long innings, and as in this session, also practiced and imparted the values of journalism over the decades. Editor of The Hindu, editor-in-chief of The Hindu, well-known journalist N. Ram. He's an award winner. I really do not need to introduce him. He is so well-known. He's the person we all turn to for advice. He is a voice who has always been consistent and spoken up for the rights and freedoms of journalists. And we have Sashi Kumar, who is a print and broadcast journalist with experience in Doordarshan. He founded the first satellite channel, AsiaNet in Kerala. He has made documentaries, films, he has even acted. And now he has founded and he chairs the Media Development Foundation, which administers the Asian College of Journalism, which is imparting the tenets of journalism that we all are so well concerned about. The format that we will be following through the day is that each speaker will speak for 20 minutes. The moderators of the sessions, if they feel that there is any point that needs to be taken further and has to be flagged, will then follow both the presentations with some questions, and then we will open it to the house, where you all who are participating and have taken your time off will be able to ask us questions by typing it on the chat. So thank you, everyone. And Mr. N. Ram, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Seema. Let me first commend this, the idea behind this one-day observance of 75 years of independence dedicated to press freedom. And I think it's apt that we start with freedom and responsibility, rights and responsibilities, under the head of media and ethics. Let me also commend the Editors Guild of India for its consistent, certainly in recent times, its consistent advocacy of freedom, but in a measured way, looking at possible mistakes made by the media and so on, but always coming to the aid of freedom and media freedom and justice. I really commend you for that. So let me start. There was a time when I used to believe, I think in the late, nearly 35, 40 years ago, that India was in an enviable position when it came to freedom of the press. But 75 years after independence, if I were to say it, I'd be accused of purveying fake news, because I think we are not in an enviable position so far as freedom of the press is concerned, of media freedom is concerned. There are international ratings. People who are in positions of power try to sort of dismiss them as something that doesn't really matter, but I think these things matter. For example, the Press Freedom Index by Reporters Without Borders, where India is ranked 150, just ahead of Pakistan, which is at 157 out of 180 countries and territories. So you can argue whether it should be 150 or 150, or 145 or 130, whatever, but it's a pretty poor ranking. And they give their reasons for this. But we don't have to rely on these alone, because we see what is happening in India, the climate of intimidation in several places, the fear, the feeling that there's a risk when you take on powerful people, whether you're talking about those in power or in the corporate sector, the resort to what is called SLAP, strategic lawsuits against public participation, which puts the fear of God into publishing houses and so on, and above all, the use of several provisions of the Indian Penal Code apart from criminal defamation, inciting hatred and so on, and also now increasingly the use of anti-terrorism laws, so-called anti-terrorism laws, and of course sedition, which is in the Indian Penal Code. The Supreme Court has stayed those proceedings, but take the example of Siddiq Kapan, who should have come out on bail, but then when you get that relief from the Supreme Court, another section weighs down on you and you're still in jail. How many years? How many months? It's just a scandal, I would say, in this. And most recently, the police action against The Wire. Of course, The Wire blundered egregiously, there's no question about it on these stories, but the way of dealing with it should be internal. Somebody files a defamation case, let the law take its course. But the Supreme Court has held that the police cannot file an FIR in several judgments on defamation. And then the other thing is the selective use of these provisions against journalists who are known to be critical of the government, of the central government, or in some cases, state governments and so on. It's not just the central government. So I think this, even though there are a limited number of such cases, the atmosphere, I think, becomes seriously distorted. And increasingly, people are resorting to self-censorship. It's called the chilling effect. If journalists are quite independent and willing to take these risks, the proprietors of major media houses are concerned. So this chilling effect, the effect of all these assaults here and there, if you like, I think it's very, very damaging to freedom of speech and expression, and in particular, media freedom. I'm not even going to go into the details of the murder of journalists. The Committee to Protect Journalists, New York-based, has been meticulously using Indian sources, documenting the number of journalists killed in connection with their work. Part of that is those deliberately murdered. Some are killed in crossfire or in dangerous assignments. But it is shameful that India figures year after year in what CPJ puts out as in the Global Impunity Index, where journalists are killed or murdered in connection with their work, and the case is not taken to finality. No justice is rendered in such cases. In many cases, the investigation just is a cover-up, or fails completely for reasons of inefficiency. So this is scandalous, and I think you must get out of that Global Impunity Index. I would say we are a founding and permanent member of that club of shame, and this is unacceptable. Given a constitution where freedom of speech and expression enjoys, protection of the kind we should be proud of. We have quarrels with this or that provision of the law. For example, criminal defamation, which should have been abolished a long time ago. We inherited it from our colonial rulers, but that's still there. So we have problems like that. But on the whole, freedom of speech and expression has been upheld over time. The Constitution guarantees it, and we must be grateful to the Supreme Court of India and the higher courts for elaborating on this and coming up with several judgments in favor of press freedom, deriving freedom of the press from freedom of speech and expression through judicial interpretation. That's on the one side, but in practice, this is being flouted in both letter and spirit. The way the police act against journalists, also sedition charges against those who covered the farmers agitation. It's completely unacceptable. Maybe they've come out on bail, but you keep it hanging. We know that nothing will eventually happen. But as the saying goes in the law, the process is the punishment. So all this has had a very cumulative negative effect. And you will find a great deal of propaganda in the Indian media today, some of them may be convinced that this is the right way to go. The kind of fractured polity we have, the polarization we have, the hate speech against minorities that we see in the political marketplace against Muslims, Christians, and others. Also, all kinds of caste hate reflected in the media. India is clearly in the thick of this hate speech, the dissemination of hate speech. And then, of course, you have disinformation on a scale that is quite alarming. Take the case of India has the largest number of users of Facebook as well as Instagram, and it's been well substantiated that there's a great deal of hate speech that that the moderators do not stop. Either they are helpless or they are unwilling to take any action against this. Seema, you mentioned the vile and barbaric, this uncivilized attack on women journalists, the threats of rape, sometimes putting pornographic content, and the kind of terrorism. This is terrorism of the worst kind in the digital space, targeted at women journalists. I don't know how much justice has been rendered in these cases or preventive action taken. Surely it is in the capability of our cyber police to find the identity, to discover the identity of these criminals, these terrorists in the digital space targeting women journalists. But it's very selective, the application of the law, the application of policies in protecting journalism. I don't want to paint a very gloomy or alarming picture, because people ask us, is this the second emergency? I've been asked that. I'm sure Sashi Kumar has been asked that. And my own answer is no, not quite. This is not the emergency, because I lived during the emergency and there was total censorship. Very few voices were able to protest in the media space, really rose to oppose the emergency. That was completely total, but it was short-lived. Today, there are spaces. There are, for example, these digital-only players who are fairly small, but very spirited, like The Wire, like many others who are out there, startups and so on. They're also within the mainstream press. Many voices which preserve their integrity, their independence in a very professional way and in an ethical way. So I don't want to, they shouldn't be underestimated. But as against that, we have, I'm afraid, some of the worst journalism in the world. You know what? You know, the red tops in the UK and so on, and some other European countries are appalling in what they do, the violation of privacy and what they put out about various people, are willing to face defamation cases because they have the resources. But in India, particularly when it comes to news television, I'm afraid I have to mention this. I don't want to name names, of course. There are channels which are adept at doing hit jobs. And this has become a serious problem. In India, you just listen to those channels. I don't want to name them. There are some in English as well as in other languages which specialize in this, and they're being used for propaganda by the government and other players as well, special interests. Having said that, now let's turn to ourselves. The phenomenon of paid news has been well documented. I don't know to what extent it prevails today. I simply have no idea, but we know that it has been around. But there are other serious problems. The lack of verification. Journalism is often defined, at least at a basic level, as first and foremost the discipline of verification. When the great Spanish writer Marquez talked about journalism and investigative journalism, he said all journalism is investigative, by which he means all serious, all quality journalism is investigative. And the first thing about an investigation is you verify, you play the devil's advocate. You try to reach out to the other side so that your own investigation is strengthened. Are we doing this? Very often not, because you're in a rush to print or broadcast, and that's a problem. A second kind of problem, which works against professionalism, I think, is the use and misuse of sources, anonymous sources, confidential sources. This is a problem not just in India, it's a global media problem. And for example, in the United States, several books have been written about it, about the whole weapons of mass destruction issue, where the New York Times and Judith Miller chapter in the New York Times, where a false narrative was built saying the weapons of mass destruction, Iraq had it. And that had something to do with creating a public opinion that supported the Iraq war, the invasion of Iraq at that time. So there are many such examples. What is the problem there? The use and misuse of sources. The way the editors allowed particular journalists to just give confidential status to sources which were very dubious, which were compromised, which were partisan, and so on. And we have that all the time in India. I'm shocked by the way reporters at every level are allowed to, by editors in many newsrooms to just give the status of anonymous source or confidential source to all kinds of people. I think we have to have rules here. We have to have both ethical and professional rules here. And I would suggest 3 rules, and this is not really original. This has been well discussed elsewhere. When do you use anonymous sources for a sensitive story? The first rule is you couldn't get that information any other way, in a straightforward way, in a way that, either publicly accessible or on the record with somebody. So it should be clear that you couldn't have got information on this sensitive subject any other way. So you have to resort to anonymity. The second rule I would say is this must be, the subject investigated must be of some public importance, of public interest, not in the sense of something that interests the public, but of genuine interest to society. So it should be clear that it's not some trivial thing where you're using these methods. And the third, it has to be supervised. It has to be supervised by somebody with experience, preferably the editor herself or himself, or somebody who has the maturity and experience to see the traps in this sort of thing. The same rules would apply to the use of deception. The use of deception is legitimate in certain contexts. This is the understanding all over the world. You mislead, you do a sting, you resort to unusual methods. But when is it justified? It's justified in the same way that I mentioned here. You couldn't have got that information any other way. 2, the information must be of public importance or public interest, the interest of society. And 3, it has to be carefully supervised. If it is not, either in the use of sources which are given anonymity or confidential source status, or the use of deception, I think these rules must be framed. In other words, you need a code of conduct. There are many codes of conduct circulating on the digital space all over the place, but are they being seriously observed? Are they being implemented in our newsrooms? Some media organizations have not even adopted them. Others, play it by the ear. There are many good professional journalists who are ethical in our media organizations. We should not undervalue them, their experience, their integrity, their idealism, and so on, their commitment to these values. But the situation has to be redeemed in our media organizations. And I think that I could offer that as a generalization. And finally, we have to accept responsibility, social responsibility. So, it's not just assertion of rights, but we want to do it ourselves through self-regulation, through the use of mechanisms like a full-time news ombudsperson, known as the reader's editor or public editor or whatever, but a full-time ombudsperson for media organizations which can afford that. And for those we cannot afford, you can find other solutions to do this. Self-correction, and of course, organizations like the Editors Guild of India intervene from time to time with statements which I think are influential, which raise hope among those who are attacked, or in some cases must pull up journalism when it goes off the track. So I think these are things that must be done. I don't want to paint too dismal a picture. We are not in a second emergency, but we are facing assaults on different fronts that need to be not just resisted, but we have to push back. And finally, I want to make a plea to our higher courts. I think the performance of the Indian judiciary when it comes to upholding these rights, media rights, I think has been inconsistent. And on the whole, I would say in recent times, quite disappointing. There have been some splendid decisions by high courts and occasionally by the Supreme Court also. But usually it comes very late. So I hope that with the new chapter opened by a new Chief Justice who has quite a long term, this chapter which has been inaugurated now recently, because a lot has been said by Justice Chandrachud and others on freedom of the press, Justice Kaul, and so on. They've given some very good judgments on this, on the right to privacy, for example. I hope that in this new chapter, a completely, a much better protection for these rights can be expected from the Supreme Court. And because the influence of the Supreme Court is so great, this will also be reflected in many high courts and in the subordinate judiciary as well, the magistrates and so on. You've got to be loyal to the Constitution. And of course, judges will be. But often there's a gap between what is said there and what is really available on the ground. And I hope the courts will be a much stronger player in championing the rights that are justly embodied in the Constitution. And of course, subject to limitations laid down in the Constitution. I thought I'll close with that, Seema, and see where.
Right. Thank you so much. That was very crucial and informative. And of course, we will get back to you with a few more questions on some of the points that you raised. I will now call on Sashi Kumar to give his presentation. I hope you can hear us now and there's no audio problem.
Thank you, Seema. Yes, I can. And congratulations to the Editors Guild of India, to you, Kumkum, with all those involved in putting this, I think, very important forum together. As we celebrate 75 years of independence, we are concerned about the independence of the media, the journalism, I mean, particularly the news media in this country, its rights and responsibilities, its constitutional place or role, and all of that. I think Ram has, of course, provided a very comprehensive kind of foregrounding to this discussion. I'd like to take it, put it in the particular context of our times. We are living in a very peculiar point in terms of freedoms of expression, really, and communication. An inflection point where if you like, in terms of the big digital, media players are, I think, being questioned. We know on the one hand what's happening to Meta and Twitter and Musk and the big players, the digital capitalists of our time. there are regulatory processes underway, and most governments are rethinking whether they should be allowed the freewheeling kind of play they've had. Some of us too have been concerned because are they content providers? Are they technical platforms? If they're content providers, are they actually subsuming the role of journalism? I mean, willy-nilly. So one would say that journalism has somehow become a subset of a larger media play, which is dominating and domineering our times. And a kind of tension has cropped up between the fortunes and this vast kind of strides the media is making and the shrinking role of journalism in this ecology. And therefore, journalism finds itself, besieged, finds itself in a kind of corner. One might say, some might say it's painted itself into a corner, but whatever it is, journalism has an existential kind of predicament to tackle on the first, journalism as pure journalism. And we, of course, at this point, therefore, we look at what is it that the Constitution provides in terms of our guarantees. Of course, Ram said it's true that it's assumed that the press freedoms are implicit in the freedom of speech and expression of Article 19(1)(a) of our Constitution and G of the Constitution. However, at this point, it's useful to quickly look at whether if we had a guaranteed press freedom, we'd be as badly off in terms of the press today as we are. In contrast with the United States, for instance, the First Amendment of the US Constitution, as you know, says Congress shall make no laws which abridge the freedom of the press. Whereas the First Amendment to the Indian Constitution actually put certain shackles, I would call them, certain constraints, which are now read as reasonable restraints on Article 19, which is what deals with freedom of speech and expression, and therefore, derivatively, freedom of the press. This happens. It's interesting to very quickly look at how this happened in the debate that which was piloted by Pandit Nehru, who wanted this reasonable restraints, which Article 19(2) bring in, and which is now cited, which is why it's important. Every time journalists are attacked, laughably they say we are invoking provisions of Article 19(2), reasonable restraint, and of course what they do is entirely unreasonable, draconian laws, putting people behind bars with without trial for a long period of time, without allowing bail, as has been cited now. Imagine it is Pandit Nehru who pilots this in the context of, it's a different context, 1950s, a provisional government in place. He says you need police power must be part of the governance of the governing power. As against this, Ambedkar, of course, again argues for the need for reasonable restraints, suggesting from his point of view that you need it in order to stave off or to counter what you call attacks on particularly the weaker sections. Freedom of speech can't go beyond a point, can't be offensive, can't affect the rights of the weaker sections particularly. Now, it's paradoxical, and but the sole argument, the sole voice that actually opposed any restrictions on freedom of speech and expression, or Article 19, against any qualification, against Article 19(2), in short, was Shyam Prasad Mukherjee, who, as you know, was he was a founder of the Bharatiya Janata Sangh, which became Bharatiya Janata Party, the ruling party today. Now look at how the roles have been reversed. We are today discussing. I think there's no point in pulling any punches here. A government which is explicitly and implicitly against freedom of speech and expression, particularly freedom of the media, freedom of press. Number one. Number two, a prime minister who doesn't even give interviews. I mean, he doesn't call for a press conference to begin with, who thinks he can leapfrog the mainstream media and talk to his constituency through the social media, tweets or Facebook or the government, channels like Man Ki Baat and so on. This is, of course, he's not alone in this. We have seen this happening in other authoritarian regimes, and the rise of authoritarian regimes in this day and time is another story. But I think an underpinning the context that we are talking about. In the United States, President Trump also, I think, wanted to do away with press conferences. He did, and then we have an environment where the formal media that we are speaking about segues into social media, which is of course problematic. On the other hand, we have these digital giants who are straddling media and technology and business and all of that. So this is the context in which we have to look at how we can preserve and safeguard the role of the mainstream media, the press, as we generically called it, as an important, shall we say, sine qua non, not just an important qualifier, as a sine qua non of democracy. it is true now than ever before that if you must say democracy in one breath, you must be able to say a free and independent media, free and independent news media in the next breath. Otherwise, that democracy is a sham. And I think that's a very good qualification. That's the litmus test. Do you have a free and freewheeling media? And therefore, to put the cart before the horse, as we often do today, to put Article 19.2 in precedence over 19.1 is to put the cart before the horse. I've seen this with great dismay happening to even, former president, the chairman of the Press Council of India, a very renowned justice. People keep citing Article 19.2 as if the big problem with India today is the freedom with which the press speaks, and this is messing up democracy in this country. So this is a narrative that is sought to be pushed because it's inconvenient for those who need to put and push the agenda that we are seeing around us, that is affecting democracy, really, affecting certainly freedom of speech and expression in this country, to allow the press free, fair play. And that's, I think, the big crisis that the press faces. That also is, therefore, the opportunity and the challenge that the press has, the news media has. How do you counter this overwhelming force that is operating against us? When we speak about rights and responsibilities, it comes, of course, with duties and, with rights and responsibilities, both must be, I think, must find equal place. You can't have rights alone and not have responsibility. But to dwell a little more on the rights, I think it's important to see that in the constitutional scheme of things, and I wish there is an actual judicial pronouncement on this, the fourth estate or the fourth pillar of democracy must be seen as belonging to the division of powers, to the separation of powers, in that process of checkmating, the executive, the legislature, the judiciary, and the fourth estate. The fourth estate is not just an honorary kind of mention. It must have an invigilating function, a check and balance function, as importantly as the other three estates or the other three pillars of democracy, although it may not be formally in the constitutional scheme so. And if you recognize that, I think we will have a healthy democracy, a vibrant democracy, a democracy where the executive doesn't run away with the ball, as is happening now, where it's not like under King Louis XVI, I am the state, and what I say is the law. I mean, in practical terms, the legislature has been suborned by the executive. The judiciary seems to have, it's a mixed kind of record, as Ram pointed out, the role of the judiciary when it comes to when things that really matters, or when push comes to shove, so to speak. So this is, I think, the importance of realizing what the rights of the media are. The rights of the media are constitutionally provided, yes, and also important to protect the Constitution, because it's a fait accompli, and this is true not just of Indian democracy, perhaps, that we give ourselves, the preamble to the Constitution says we give unto ourselves the Constitution, right? But what happens in all governments, I think, democracies to one extent or the other, is that governments that take over make it their business, and they're preoccupied with how you can deny the people the constitutional rights. That seems to be the role of governments in one form or the other, more so in this context, maybe less so in some other context. And who can oppose that? It is the judiciary and the free press. And if the free press is handicapped, if the free press is marginalized, if the free press is collusive, in our context, that's the other problem. If the free press lends itself to being a propaganda arm of the government, if it lays itself supine before those in power, if it actually is more loyal than the king, as we are seeing happening, then we have a real problem. And unfortunately, we are also living in a time when in journalism schools, I know there are newfangled ideas like solutions journalism. The thrust of it is, of course, very different and honorable. It says media should not just keep pointing out mistakes and problems. It should also provide solutions. This is, I think, a poor cousin of what we call development journalism. And development journalism has wrought havoc in this country. I've seen that at first hand when I was at Doordarshan. You had 20-point program, we had this or that. And the role of people in Doordarshan, journalists in Doordarshan, including me at that time, was to make sure that all this was reaching the farthest corners of the country without any critical elements, without interrogating them, without any filters. That is all good, tonic for the people. So this is, I think, the context in which we are. The peculiar thing, compounding, I think, influence or the aspect of this is that, as you said in your preliminary remarks, social media has become a huge problem. Social media is not, you're not just hate speech and gender, polarity and just, any norm of decency has been, jettisoned. But who or what is the force really behind, which is actually occupying the center stage in social media? It is the troll armies, which are abetted, initiated, I suspect, abetted certainly, and promoted by political parties. And the ruling party of the day, I think, has a big role to play. I'm not suggesting others don't, but you will find that these are manifestations of that. They are encouraged by them, they are fueled by them, they are propelled by them, and therefore they have the kind of space they have in social media. And therefore, when we speak about disinformation, misinformation, and hate speech, which are the huge problems that we face today, the peculiarity or the uniqueness of it in our context perhaps is they are by and large initiated by the party in power, or by those who have access to those in power, or those who have the support of those in power. That makes it that much more difficult, that much more formidable to tackle. So how do you go about handling something like that? So this is, I think, and when mainstream media segues into social media, it becomes that much more difficult. And the laws that are being formulated, whether it's in terms of guidelines for the digital media, for instance, the digital news portals will come under that category. They are in fact a part of social media in that sense, because they are all being judged by the same yardstick. They all belong to the same category in terms of how mechanisms of complaint, how redressal mechanisms are to be followed. And this, I think, is a category mix, which is probably deliberate, but very dangerous for bold and, shall we say, independent journalism, which we have seen emerge in terms of digital news portals. I don't have to mention names. So I think at the forefront of good media today are some of the digital news media portals, which are doing exceedingly well in print, in video, in audio, in the multimedia form that is current day journalism. So this, I think, is another big problem. So in short, I think, as Fali Mariman said, we are in a situation where, do we have freedom of speech? Yes. But do we have freedom after speech? No. We have freedom of speech, but freedom after speech is up in the air. And we are seeing the consequences of that by those who are taking, who are at the receiving end because of this. Journalists who are in jail. And it's not a coincidence, therefore, that containing disinformation and misinformation would be seen as an act against those in power or the vested interests of the day. Which is why it's no coincidence that you go after alt news and you go after Zubair, because it's a huge inconvenience for whom to be in power and to have the dominant narrative out there. It's important to have a regime of disinformation and misinformation. So we have to evolve media ethics, media practices, which recognize this to begin with, which recognize this current media problematic ecology, to parse it, to understand it, and the media must be able to counter this. And therefore, I think it's important to reinvent, reimagine the role of journalism, keeping the cardinal principles, the core values intact, there's no doubt about that, but bring it abreast of the requirements of our time, not just technologically, but also in terms of the logistics, the way it's functioning, and the power politics of which it is an unwitting part. And this, I think, is a peculiar challenge of our time. And therefore, I think when we speak about media ethics and media practices and what is it that's important before us, one must recognize also that the millennial generation, which is moving into the media with passion, with commitment, and I see that at the ACJ, year after year, we get, and happily, invariably, almost consistently every year, at least 60 to 70% of those who are joining journalism are women. Although arguably the glass ceiling may still be intact, but there are a lot of women out there. So there's a kind of gender shift that's taking place. And many of them are driven by the passion to play a transformative role in society. They're concerned about how they can do that. And journalism, which does not have the transformative qualities, is of course of no use. They recognize that. But when you move out into the actual world, this is you're buffeted by these contradictory and confusing forces. And it's important, therefore, I think, for the big players, shall we say, the journalists who can make a difference organizationally, independently, to set an example, to try and understand the ecology and see what we can do about it. So these are some thoughts I have on how I think we can retrieve the importance of journalism, retrieve the role of journalism as an enabler of democracy, because an informed citizenry ultimately makes for a mature democracy. And I think, yes, I agree that we don't have a formal emergency, but there is, and there's no running away from it. There is a sense of fear. There's a sense of anxiety. There is a sense of preemptive censorship. There is a sense of, not just in the formal media, even in social media now, people are worried about how much they can say what in WhatsApp messages to each other. Because after Pegasus and so on, we don't know who's listening to you, when and how. The right to privacy, your right to privacy and personal dignity. So I'd conclude by saying that the father of the current Chief Justice of India, Justice Y.V. Chandrachud, famously said in his judgment on Minerva Mills and others versus Union of India, as part of the judgment, he said only three articles in the Constitution, and only three, make the difference between the heaven of freedom that Tagore, imagined in his great poem, where the mind is without fear and so on, and descending to the abyss of authoritarian power, of autocratic power. And he said those three articles were Article 14, Article 19, and Article 21. Article 14, of course, is equality before the law. Article 19, freedom of speech and expression, and all that we discussed. And Article 21, right to life and personal liberty, in which right to privacy and all that is intact. So I think we need to look at these as what give us the rights, the power for journalism itself, apart from Article 19. And journalism must move out into a realm of protecting the rights, not just of journalism, but of the citizenry in a democracy as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. This was both very illuminating presentations. We are getting some questions. I would request all who are with us that please feel free to type your questions in chat. And while you do that, and we'll go through them with the speakers, I wanted to set the ball rolling with a couple of questions. One very obvious one, Mr. Ram, is what you said about the emergency. And of course, it was the state that had imposed censorship in a big time, and all of you suffered and faced it and knew about it. But over the years, especially afterwards and with the advent of television in particular, I think the state sort of moved and allowed the corporates to come in and start exercising that control. And now we've come to a period where there is corporate control on the media, and there is also the state assistance, as you would call it, in bringing an atmosphere of fear and in controlling the media. So while it might not be emergency as it was, wouldn't you agree that there is a great deal of intimidation with all kinds of laws being used against journalists now?
Yes, the situation is different and more complicated, more complex, because other factors, this is at play. There was a question about media capture earlier, I saw on chat. Yes, you also see that phenomenon, particularly in the broadcast television space, the news television space. It's yet to happen, I think, in a big way in the press sector. And so on. So these are new things. And then disinformation that Sashi Kumar talked about, disinformation, not disinformation that is spontaneous, so to speak, but disinformation that is orchestrated for a political project or projects. That's what we are talking about. These are new things, and I'm not suggesting they are any less challenging, but you shouldn't make a category mistake, because that's my point. That was total, it was short-lived maybe, but it came with a constitutional veneer, what happened at that time. Now, many of what is happening are not constitutional, not even legal, and some of them are rogue practices. The attacks on women journalists on this, as part of this disinformation campaign is akin to terrorism or extremism, which is extremely dangerous, vile. So there are things that we didn't have before. That is also true. Things that are worse in some respects. But I made the point that because people then feel, they throw up their hands. What can you do if there's an emergency? Because it was total. And it happened, and I would say, looking at it even today, that the response of the press was very, not just disappointing, it was dismal. And that famous statement attributed to Mr. Advani,
You asked to bend and you crawled.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which I think is an apt description of the performance of the media, of the press sector at that time. We only had the press at that time, basically. The rest was in the government. So now the situation is more complex, but the point is there are spaces and there are actors, there are players who still practice good journalism that is suitable for the present age, in some cases, small players maybe, and within big organizations, some individuals or small tendencies, good investigations are done, good opinion pieces are published, they are well written. There was a question about that as well, which I see on chat, that people who are outside the media, NGOs and others, activists, other constituencies who have the opportunity to contribute op-ed pieces, they are threatened. The police, that we're watching you, etc. So I think all these are new, which we didn't have at that time, not in this way anyway. But it's not very useful for me to compare it with the emergency, because that in some ways it was less toxic. It was an awful thing, but you didn't have the kind of hate, the climate of hate and the communal poison that is injected all the time on the social media today. At that time, you had some things which are even worse. But I don't want that to be mixed up. That was the point, not to underestimate the problems that we face today.
Right. Sashi, I wanted to ask you about the institution of the editor. You know, a lot of us who sort of grew up in journalism in the 80s, for us, the primary learning force of ethics and responsibilities were the editors, because these were also people drawn from the field. They were professionals. They knew what journalism was. They weren't appointed as hired hands or CEOs of companies. Now, this has gradually changed. It's taken time. It hasn't happened overnight. It's not that it is today and wasn't there yesterday. It's grown, as you yourself know better than most of us. So the fact that now we have non-editors as editors, I mean, non-journalists, I would say, as editors, what's the kind of impact that you see it having, or it has, on a newsroom? The fact
Yeah, I got it. I think it's a byproduct of the total corporatization of the media, particularly after the 1990s. So, for instance, the jargon changes, the perception changes. Manmohan Singh was called not the Prime Minister of India alone, but the CEO of India. You characterize a Prime Minister as a CEO because it has a corporate kind of idea. And I think at some point, owners of newspapers said, okay, you want freedom of the press, you have freedom of the press, but you also get me the financial bottom line. And so you had this combination of editors also becoming CEOs, and that became a pattern. I mean, there'd be a few exceptions to that, perhaps in India. In the media, either you were also taking the advertising and the marketing into good account and going by what they said, or you yourself combine the role in, you become CEO, come chief editor. And that, I think, is the beginning of the dilution of the role of the editor. I mean, there was a time when editors and marketing, this kind of touch me not. They didn't even talk to each other. It was seen as pollution if marketing came into the editorial department and said something, and so on and so forth. That's obviously changed. Now you're tailing the requirements of marketing. Now, I think all newspapers, to be honest, are tailing that to some extent or the other. It's a question of degree, not of kind. And also, for instance, I mean, you when you spoke to Ram about the corporatization and the emergency, you see, when I was in college and doing my postgraduate, we were shall we say, we were always taunting what you call the jute press. We said this whole, and as it turned out, it was a jute press which stood against the emergency. I mean, the Goenka who symbolizes or personifies that press was at the end of the day the one who didn't buckle, who neither bent nor crawled. So these are all lessons for it. So corporatization, if the metal of the person at the top, if the man is made of steel and if it's not made of a feet of sand, it will make a big difference. Or feet of clay, it will make a big difference. So that, I think, is However, the fact is there's a paradigm shift. The role of journalism in our independence struggle and post-independence building period of India has been one of democracy, protecting democracy, citizens' rights, and all of that. With the paradigm shift of the neoliberalism, if you like, of market economy, in John Milton's Aeropagitica, we talk about it in J School. There is famous opening which says, "Whoever knew truth put to the worst in a free and open encounter." This was a famous American idea of marketplace of ideas. But now there's no marketplace of ideas in terms of collision. It's a marketplace, period.
Right. Okay, so I think you will.
Seema, may I add to what the list Sashi provided on this corporatization, pointing out that now journalism is treated as a brand. When you really mean reputation, the use of the word brand has become quite rampant in journalism. I mean, it may appear to be quibbling, but I think you're really talking about reputation. In fact, whenever somebody says brand, I translate it into for the journalism context as reputation.
Yeah, absolutely. So true. So there's the first question for you, Ram, whether you've sort of looked at it, that India is witnessing a media capture phenomenon. It's by Anant Pradhan, where he says that it's this media capture in the context of legacy mainstream media, and how is this impacting on the information sphere?
It will have a big impact. One such example is being enacted right now. There was a question about NDTV, what's happened. I've spoken about it. I don't know if this is the forum, but if it is, then I'm happy to say that there will be a change in the journalism. There's no doubt about it. It's in progress. I've seen Mr. Gautam Adani's interview given to the Financial Times, where he says that we want to be global. We want to become global, get a global footprint like the Financial Times and Al Jazeera. And he talks about it as a responsibility. He also says that when the government goes wrong, by all means criticize it, but you should have the courage, that's the word used, we should have the courage to acknowledge, if the government does the right thing, and it's sort of development, what Sashi Kumar called sort of development journalism perspective is being upheld in that response in the interview, if you look at it carefully. But I've spoken on it to Karan Thapar and elsewhere, and others have also spoken on it. So you may not want to dwell too much on these details, but yes, media capture, there was already a media capture earlier. But as I said, I think it's, as far as I know, it's in news television in a big way. It's yet to manifest itself as a significant phenomenon in the press sector, as far as I can tell, unless there are areas where I am not aware of where it happened.
Right.
It will change the content and tone of journalism. There's no doubt about it. If that happens, and we used to feel lucky that this hadn't happened in India. Of course, there was big business involved, but not the really top businesses. Houses like the Tatas, I think, kept away from getting into media, and even Mr. Dhirubhai Ambani, I think, did that for their own reasons. They didn't want to get, I think, into controversial areas, because media is, it's always a contested space, being in the media. It's never a total unified space, and it should not be, because I think that's what journalism is about. It is contested. It should be contested vigorously, actively, all the time. So I think that's changed. It's changing.
Right.
Yes.
So the next question I'll ask you, Sashi, it's from Anuradha Bazin, whether this is a second emergency. To a great extent, Mr. Ram's answered that. And should we measure censorship only through what is overt? It's taking that same question forward. You can see it in front of you. Is censorship today not being exercised through multiple strategies, including covert censorship through intimidation, official reports, etc., etc.?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I agree. Of course, technically, this may not be an emergency in the sense that it's not declared. It's not, it's formal. But there is, I think, an informal emergency in place, if you want to use the term emergency. It's true that, as I said, we are all worried. You think somebody's looking over your shoulder, somebody's breathing down your neck. Journalists are, I think, preemptively censoring themselves. The people who are reading newspapers seem to know that. Why is it that and part of it is brought upon itself by journalists themselves? We must, I think, not forget one part of this, which probably we haven't touched on. There is also a growing credibility crisis that the media is facing. The people-media connect isn't, I think, as strong in terms of credibility factor as it was before. Partly because maybe a section of the media has brought this upon us, but I don't think people are believing implicitly anything that comes in the media, right? They think, oh, they have this or that angle, they'll say this. Because, and this is what the government of the day or a ruling party of the day draws its power, its boldness from. They know that there's a huge constituency out there which will believe us in preference to the media. Now that is a peculiar situation we have, and I think we are partly to blame for that. When I say we, a section of the media is partly to blame for that, and a section of the media is also is also reinforcing that idea out there. So these, I think, on the one hand, therefore, you have a media which cannot, which feels it cannot speak truth to power, cannot comfort the afflicted or afflict the comfortable, all of that. On the other hand, you have a media which believes, like Nietzsche did in the context of, in the context of, if you like, as a comment on the Germany in the 30s, that the history of truth is the history of the longest lasting falsehood. You keep repeating a lie again and again and again, and that becomes a norm, that becomes the normative, even if not the truth. And on the other hand, you have another category where you think, you're going against the idea of, say, what Yevtushenko said, that when truth is replaced by silence, that silence is a lie. Now, these are all different forms of censorship, or different forms of being remiss as media practitioners, because you may not say something when you should obviously be dealing with a particular subject. You look away from it and deal with something else, a soft subject, or you deal with it in a manner that, in a tokenist manner, you've dealt with it, but you have not really called a spade a spade. You have not said what should be said about it. You've said everything around it except what should be said about it. So these are ever so many ways in which you tiptoe around the fact, tiptoe around the truth, because the time it's inconvenient to actually call a spade a spade. Right. Pierre Bourdieu calls it dig here, not there, the phenomenon. When you need to be dig here and you'll find water, you know deliberately you don't want to dig there, you'll dig all around it and find, oh, we didn't find water. So I think these are all ways in which forms of censorship, forms of prevarication, shall we say, are being practiced now.
Right. Mr. Ram, you answered or referred to Ranjan Solomon's question. I think you've spoken of NDTV, etc. But one point that he has raised, I think, is important, because we as people from the media do look upon the citizenry as well. And he has asked what alternatives and responsibilities do citizens have, and I would sort of specify it in concerning the throttling of the media. What can citizens of India do about this? I mean, they're surely not passive onlookers.
Citizens who care about it should be more active on the social media, countering all that disinformation. Maybe it's difficult, it's challenging, but I think there's more scope for that on the social media. They can, if there is something totally unjust, a police raid, a seizure, they can come out on the streets and do orderly protests, not just stay at home, not remain neutral or just bystanders. I think they should get more active if they really value media freedom. But it won't happen spontaneously. It has to be organized, I would say. But if I may say something on this disinformation, yeah. I think very often we use these words in a lazy way because there is a meaningful distinction to be made, which scholars make but few journalists do, between misinformation and disinformation. It's not just a terminological issue. Misinformation is something that we do all the time. we try to minimize it because mistakes are made and there are ways to correct it. It's not motivated or deliberate. This information is motivated and deliberate, and it's scaled up on the social media platforms, the messaging apps, the search apps, all that. And that is the big threat. Misinformation can also harm. For example, on COVID, wrong information could, you may really believe it. But the real danger, the real threat is from disinformation, which is scaled up. So I think these two categories have to be clearly differentiated because the response has to be different. In one case, so far as the media are concerned, you have a way of tackling it through due process within the organization or within the profession, if you like. And in the other case, it's very often a political and legal issue.
Right.
They respond completely differently. And sometimes the media, they are huge and the media are relatively small. We are quite big compared with what happened 30 years ago. But compared with what Meta offers or Google or Twitter, any national media sector would be quite limited in what it can do.
Right.
Seema, can I just quickly
Yeah.
add something to that very quickly on the question of citizens and their rights? You see, we have a Right to Information Act. The citizens therefore have a right and expectation from media to be informed. It's only then, the Right to Information Act must implicit in it must be the right of the citizen to be informed. And who plays who plays that role? It's the media. And are we doing that? Is that something we should introspect? Secondly, I think it's been a long practice. I don't know why. We journalists, media, we are like thick as thieves. We should be able to call out bad apples. We should be able to call out bad apples. We shouldn't, get worried about it and go quiet on that, because they are really giving a bad name to the entire profession. And that, I think, for instance, several years ago in the US, I know the Pew Research Center, they held a kind of survey of which profession in society do people trust the least. And this was several years ago, and I suspect the results will be far worse now. And they found that the media, journalism, rated just a notch above second-hand car salesman. Because the guy will say anything to sell his car. So it's a long-standing problem. But I think one solution is, and I think at time there was a period in between where the media would talk about the media. I don't see a program on media, parsing the media in Indian television. You have that on BBC, for instance, where you discuss what the media discuss and look at, how do you call out these issues? We did that in the early days of Asianet. Of course, we got into trouble now and then with the big press,
right.
But I think that's an important part of introspection in the media at this critical time.
Right. Rajiv Khanna's question about the institution of editors, we've already discussed, but I'll stay with you, Shashi, on a little bit more about this, on not just how genuine journalists deal with it, but the very fact that a lot of the journalists against whom there is intimidation are stringers, or they write for different papers, are not on the rolls, and then they find that they're in jail or they're being harassed with little money and nobody behind them. This is becoming an increasing problem. It comes from that whole exploitation of stringers, and now this. So how do we deal with this?
Yeah, that's, I think, also a legacy of the recent legacy that, the unionization in journalism has collapsed. There are no organizations which are very tenable, which have clout, which have teeth. There were journalist unions, there were federations, journalistic bodies which were very powerful. They could influence the outcome of wage boards, and so on and so forth. But that regime is gone again because of the neoliberal regime, that we are under. And therefore, this is a natural. So the situation of stringers or freelancers, as you rightly put it, is far worse. On the other hand, I think to look at the positive side of it, because of the emergence of what you call social media and the fact that it's an infinitesimal space with infinitesimal potential, at least theoretically, blogs, Facebook posts have become an important backyard of journalism. Remember Glenn Greenwald, who broke probably one of the biggest stories we know today. Who interviewed Edward Snowden, whom Edward Snowden trusted with all of that cache of information. was technically a blogger, in Guardian. He wasn't a formal journalist in that sense. And you find blog posts sometimes giving you far more information than formal journalism does. In conflict areas, for instance, like in Syria or Iraq and so on, it's well known that, I mean, you see journalists on television standing on top of terraces of their hotels with the top of the palm frond behind them, because they can't venture out there, they'll be blown up. So it's the local stringers, as you said, the freelancers, a housewife, a lawyer, a student, a truck driver, who is feeding them the information which is collated, and that becomes, which is a valuable function. But I'm saying citizen journalism has become a cliche, but there are manifestations of that are still valid now. So the hierarchy of the editor, therefore, was bound to, I think, fail, or bound to shall be diluted. It was bound to become this because of digital possibilities. And therefore, the digital paradigm shift, I think, partly responsible for the marginalization of the editor, is my structural reading of it.
Seema, if I may say something on this.
Yeah.
I think through the pandemic and the lockdowns, professional journalism has gained some value. So, there's no doubt about it. The Reuters Institute for Journalism Studies at Oxford came up with research on that. It was pretty low, the stock of journalism earlier, public trust and so on. But definitely, in comparison with what there has been on the social media, professional journalism has gained in credibility right through the pandemic. There's no doubt about it. And I think it applies to India. There have been some excellent work, in my opinion, in various media outlets, which are of educative value, combating disinformation and misinformation on COVID-19, on the virus, its effects and so on. And in comparison, you see all the rubbish and the noise that you saw on the social media. Having said that, on Twitter and so on, there have been some excellent scientists who post, people who are specialists, who have done very good work. This also has to be recognized. But compared with the noise there is and the rubbish that came to us on the social media, I think professional journalism has done valuable work, and it has helped it gain enhance its credibility. So I think the lesson from this is we must not just romanticize about citizen journalism. Right. Of course, citizens should have opportunities, but earlier there was a sort of romantic attitude to it. But I think we must more sharply differentiate what is professional from what is not there. So this may even sound a bit problematic in theories of democracy, on theories of democracy, but I think it's the duty, the responsibility of journalism and organizations like the Editors Guild, in my opinion. You can do a lot to upvalue the profession, the professional traits, the what the elements of journalism, as they're sometimes.
Right. So sorry, I'm just recovering from some cough. So we are just going to, I start rolling together some questions. There's Vidya Subramaniam, who's asked whether dealing with the ironic situation of restricted freedom of press on one hand and full freedom for propaganda, so, on the other. So are we really coming down to that where if you say it as it is, there can be action against you, whereas when you say it as it is not, you can get full support. Ram?
Yes, I think that's a very good insight, but on the second point, it's not completely unrestricted. It's selectively applied. You can get away, some sections, some posters can get away with it, depending on what ideology they represent or what politics they represent, whereas others are punished in a very harsh way for just posts. We've seen many examples of this on Facebook and so on. So that is true, I think. That irony or paradoxical situation holds. I think it's a good point.
So there is, of course, they also want, Nimisha Tiwari wants you to suggest role models, persons, editors. I don't know if you want to go there. Mr. Ram, that's for you. And people that you can,
There
you
are
can
many role models. Many role models. I'll start with one who's right in the public eye, Prannoy Roy. I think Prannoy Roy is certainly a role model for television journalism, not just a pioneer, but I think somebody who's upheld the independence of the news media in a way that is very influential. He's influenced a number of journalists, a number of important journalists now broadcasting. Were raised in that stable, the NDTV stable. And I think that's one example. But there are also the old world, apart from the great political leaders who are also journalists, like Bahl Tilak or Gandhiji or Nehru, and so on. I can think of professional editors like Frank Moraes. I would completely disagree with his views, but certainly an outstanding journalist, or somebody like Girilal Jain of the Times of India, who was my friend, senior friend. We didn't always agree. You mentioned Kuldeep Nair earlier.
I think there's...
And there are many others and younger people as well. So it's possible.
Like Mr. Ram himself. So now Divya, Shashi said something about the educated and the uneducated, and one being rational and not the other. And it's the educated class that believes and forwards news promoting hatred. And how do we see and tackle this? And also the next question, which Anant Pradhan is again raised, that we need media reforms, like restrictions, independent media regulators, revival of trade unions, journalists. Is that dangerous territory, or is it something we really need to look at?
Well, I certainly, to the first part, I think, yes, we have universal adult franchise. So we can't proceed on the assumption of a qualified democracy in that sense. But it's true, I think, that it is the educated, it is the middle class, which I think tends to become more vociferous and vehement and poisonous sometimes on social media, partly because the values that they think are important are being jettisoned, or the media is challenging them, or what they want to happen is being objected to, or is there's an obstruction to that, and so on. Media reform, I think, is really a very interesting idea. It's an important idea, and unless the media get together and do it, I mean, it's basically partly a part of self-regulation in the media, whether there should be external regulation or internal regulation and reform in the media. I'm all for internal reform. I think external regulation is dangerous for the media in any form. So the media, I think, if you're responsible for parsing, analyzing, conveying what's your context to your people, you should also be able, I think, you're mature enough and and any external regulation is a euphemism for kept media, for non-media, for non-freedom in a media, in my view. I think any democracy worth the name will not allow an external regulator in the media, because that, I think, will be the end of free and independent media. I just wanted to add one quick name to role models in the media, and that's Karl Marx, because I think he was one of the greatest journalists the world's ever seen, although paradoxically, socialist and communist regimes haven't had free media. So that's one of the big paradoxes of our times. Yeah.
Right. So Sunny Sebastian has, of course, asked a question that all the younger journalists and the employees and the working journalists are feeling. And about, yes, that they're poorly paid, they've lost their jobs during the pandemic, they've lost their job, and they lose their job in the hundreds, which I said earlier, whenever there's ownership shifts, or they just want to retrench. And it's the working journalists that's really facing it. So Ram, what do you feel about this, and how can we protect them further?
I think Sashi Kumar referred to it, the weakening and sort of dissolution of unionization or collective action among journalists. I think you really require that. And, it is a problem. But as against it, year after year, Sashi Kumar and I can speak for him also, I think we are surprised by people who come into journalism, to the Asian College of Journalism, for example, and elsewhere. So there is that spirit among the young who despite these uncertain times for journalism, want to come in, which is a very hopeful, hope-giving phenomenon, I think. We see then particularly female, particularly women, young women coming in all the time. And sometimes we ask them, why are you coming? This is not the job. This is not going to pay the best paying job and so on, and interesting answers. But that spirit, I think, must be strengthened. But there must also be fighting spirit when some injustice is done, and collective action is the way to do this. So I think you've got to re-engineer collective action in the in media organizations and in the media sector, and counter the present tendencies. That's the only thing that will protect. You can't rely on external players to protect. You got to organize and protect yourself.
Right. Sashi, I'm going to let you have the last word, simply because it's for the students and for the young people. I find myself at a loss when addressing interns and, trying to persuade them that journalism is still the best profession. And we were so passionate about it as we grew up. What do I tell them now? You come to the world where you can be intimidated, you can be harassed, you might not get a job, you get a job, you lose it overnight, you face abuse in the newsroom, you might have a case against you if you speak the truth. What do you tell them?
Yes, it is very difficult, but I think the combativeness of it also appeals to them. The sense of adventure also appeals to students. They know that it's an uphill task, that it's not going to be, I don't think they like a cushy job as soon as they graduate from a J school. And more importantly, I think, it's not a dead end. Journalism is not a dead end at all. I mean, entrepreneurial journalism, for instance, has become very important in J schools, and we have also instituted in a big way over the last 2 years. And many students, you'll find that, in fact, Ram has a joke that many big media organizations, I think we're speaking about the Hindu, etc., they have a revolving door for ACJ graduates because they come and they go. They don't stay on,
Absolutely.
And that's for good reason, because they find that what they are doing there is not, sometimes it's shallow, sometimes they don't know what they want to do. But I think mostly it's because they don't find, what they're doing is not as exciting as they wanted to, or what they wanted to do. So they're very choosy. I think they know what they want to do. They shift jobs, mobility is very high. And entrepreneurial possibilities are great because of digital media. Many of them are, many of our students, for instance, alumni, have set up their own portals in different specialized areas, not just political journalism. It may be on golf, it may be on techie, technology, it may be on cuisine, it may be on food, it may be on travel. So journalism is a vast space, and a lot of exciting things are happening there. And therefore, I think certainly the last word in this program shouldn't be that journalism is a dull profession. It certainly is far more exciting and far more adventurous and far more challenging than it was before. And so bring it on should be your attitude.
Right. That's good to know. All right. Thank you so much. It was, we've kept you a long time, and thank you for being so patient with the questions and the absolutely superb presentations. Thank you. And now we are moving straight into our next session on funding. Raghav is the moderator. So I'm handing the floor over to him. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All the best.